Lucky Luciano put a gun on the table, not to clean it, not to show it off, to make Dean Martin understand one thing: sing tonight or die tomorrow. Dean looked at the gun, looked at Lucky Luciano, the most feared mobster in American history. A man who had ordered hundreds of murders. A man nobody said no to. Nobody. Dean picked up the gun. 80 people in that room held their breath. What Dean did in the next 10 seconds made Lucky Luciano, the man who ran the American Mafia, do something he had never done for anyone in his entire life. He kneeled. This is the story of October 1954, the night Dean Martin proved that real power has nothing to do with guns. Lucky Luciano was born in 1897 in Sicily. He came to America as a child. By the 1930s, he had created the modern American Mafia. He organized crime the way corporations organize business: territories, hierarchies, rules that everyone followed or died trying to break. He was deported to Italy in 1946 after serving time in prison. But even in exile, he remained the most powerful organized crime figure in the world. When Lucky Luciano wanted something, he got it. When he gave an order, it was followed. When he made a threat, people believed it completely, because Lucky Luciano never made threats he could not keep. He had eliminated rivals. He had corrupted politicians. He had built an empire that stretched from New York to Los Angeles to Cuba to Italy. And in October of 1954, he was in Las Vegas, visiting quietly, conducting business that could not be discussed on the telephone, meeting with the men who ran the casinos and the unions and the money. Nobody knew exactly how many decisions were made in those meetings. Nobody knew how many men had their futures decided in private rooms that week. Nobody knew how many careers were ended before they began by a single conversation with Lucky Luciano. The men who sat across from him in those rooms smiled when they left. They smiled because the alternative was unthinkable. Las Vegas in 1954 was a mob town in every way that mattered. The Sands Hotel where Dean Martin performed regularly was partially owned by organized crime figures. The Flamingo, the Desert Inn, the casinos that made Las Vegas what it was were all connected to the same network of power that Lucky Luciano sat at the center of. Performers who worked these rooms understood the reality. You did what the men who owned the venues told you to do. You showed up when they wanted. You performed for who they chose. And you never said no, until Dean Martin's. Dean Martin in October 1954 was in a vulnerable position. He had ended his partnership with Jerry Lewis just 3 months earlier in July. The split had been major news. Martin and Lewis had been the biggest comedy act in America. Movies, television, nightclubs, records, they had made millions together. And now Dean was alone, starting over, trying to prove he could succeed as a solo performer. The industry was skeptical. Most people thought Jerry had been the talent. Most people thought Dean had been just the straight man. The handsome singer who set up the jokes and looked good doing it. Dean was working constantly to prove them wrong. He had bookings at the Sands. He was recording. He was taking every opportunity to show that Dean Martin, without Jerry Lewis, was still a star worth watching. But he needed the work. He needed the venues. He needed the casinos to keep booking him. And everyone in Las Vegas knew that the casinos were controlled by men who did not respond well to being told no. Nobody talked openly about it. Nobody wrote about it in the newspapers. Nobody discussed it at dinner parties or in polite company. But everybody in the entertainment world understood how things worked. The men who ran the rooms controlled the careers of the people who performed in them. One bad word from the right person and a performer disappeared from the booking sheets. No confrontation, No explanation. Just silence where the work used to be. Dean understood this reality as well as anyone. He had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where organized crime was not abstract. His father had worked in establishments that had connections. Dean knew these men, knew how they thought, knew what they were capable of. He was not naive about power or violence or the cost of crossing the wrong people. But Dean also had something that made him different from most performers in his position. He had principles about how he would and would not be treated. And he had reached a point in his life where those principles mattered more than safety. Nobody knew that was about to be tested. Nobody could have predicted what would happen when those principles met the most dangerous man in American organized crime. Nobody who knew Dean understood how far he was willing to go to protect who he was. The message came to Dean's dressing room on a Tuesday evening in mid-October. He was preparing for his regular show at the Sands. The casino was full. His performances had been going well. The solo career was building momentum. The dressing room smelled like cigarette smoke and cold cream and the particular kind of quiet that comes before a performance. Dean was focused. He was always focused before a show. It was the one time in his life when the easy smile disappeared and something more serious took its place. A man in an expensive suit knocked on the door. Dean's manager opened it. The man said Mr. Luciano would like Dean to perform at a private gathering on Thursday night. Dean asked what the booking fee would be. The man looked confused by the question. He said there was no fee. This was an honor, an invitation. Dean said he did not perform for free. The man said he would relay the message. He left. Dean's manager was already panicking. He told Dean this was not a request that could be declined. This was Lucky Luciano. Dean said he understood who it was. He also understood that he was a professional performer who worked for agreed fees, not for invitations, not for honors. The manager said Dean was making a terrible mistake. Dean said maybe, but it was his mistake to make. The next message came Wednesday afternoon. More direct this time. Mr. Luciano expects Dean Martin at the private party Thursday night, 8 o'clock. The Sands private room. Dean sent back the same response. He would be happy to perform for an agreed booking fee. Otherwise, he had prior commitments. The silence that followed that message was the kind of silence that preceded storms. Dean's manager was now genuinely terrified. He told Dean that people who refused Lucky Luciano did not have long careers. Sometimes they did not have long lives. Witness. Dean asked his manager if he thought Lucky Luciano would actually have him killed over a performance. The manager said he did not know, but he did not want to find out. Dean said that was a fair answer. But Dean was not changing his position. Nobody in Las Vegas had ever done this. Nobody had refused a direct request from Lucky Luciano twice. Nobody had sent back the same response after being told who was asking. The word was already spreading through the connected world. Dean Martin had said no, twice, to Lucky Luciano, and he was still standing. For now. Other performers heard about it and went quiet. Nobody called Dean to congratulate him. Nobody sent a message of support. Because nobody wanted to be associated with a man who had just aimed himself directly at a wall and refused to turn around. Lucky Luciano was the most powerful organized crime figure in the world. Dean Martin was a singer trying to build a solo career in mob-controlled Las Vegas. The power imbalance was absolute. When Lucky Luciano wanted something, he got it. When he gave an order, it was followed. Nobody said no to Lucky Luciano. Nobody. Dean Martin had just said no twice. What happened next would test everything Dean believed about power and principle. We are trying to reach 700 subscribers to keep these stories alive. We are at 300 right now. If stories like this matter to you, the moments when courage meant risking everything, the decisions that defined character, subscribe now. There is an entire Dean Martin playlist waiting. What Lucky Luciano did on Thursday evening would change how the mob saw Dean Martin forever. Thursday evening arrived. Dean performed his regular show at 8 o'clock. The audience loved it. He was in the middle of That's Amore when his manager appeared in the wings looking like he had seen a ghost. Dean finished the song, took his applause, walked off stage. His manager said Lucky Luciano was in the building. Dean said he assumed as much since the private party was happening. His manager said no. Luciano was here, at Dean's show, sitting in the audience watching. Dean looked through the curtain. Third row center. Lucky Luciano. Surrounded by men who were clearly not there for the music, Dean went back to his dressing room. He had 15 minutes before he needed to be back on stage for the second half of the show. He was changing his shirt when the knock came. His manager opened the door. The same man from Tuesday stood there. He said Mr. Luciano would like a word. Dean said to send him in. The manager started to protest. Dean told him to step outside. The manager left looking like he might actually faint. Lucky Luciano walked into the dressing room. He was shorter than Dean expected, maybe 5'8", but the presence was undeniable. This was a man who had spent decades making other men afraid. It showed in how he moved, how he looked at things, how the air in the room changed when he entered. He closed the door behind him. Dean stood, not in challenge, just in respect. Two men meeting. Luciano spoke first. He said he had heard Dean was refusing his invitation. Dean said he had not refused an invitation. He had declined to perform without a booking fee. Luciano asked if Dean understood who he was talking to. Dean said he did. Charles Luciano, the man who had reorganized crime in America. Luciano smiled slightly. He said most people called him Lucky. Dean said he would call him Mr. Luciano unless invited to do otherwise. Luciano studied Dean's face for a long moment, looking for the fear that should have been there, looking for the trembling that every other man showed at this point in the conversation. He did not find it. Most men at this point would have started talking faster, started explaining themselves, started finding reasons why the situation was different from what it looked like. Dean did none of those things. He waited. He had nothing to prove and nothing to apologize for. He had made his position clear before Luciano ever walked into the room. All he was doing now was standing behind it. Nobody in that room knew what was about to happen. Nobody had prepared for this. Nobody had a script for what two men said to each other when principal met power in a Las Vegas dressing room in October of 1954. Then Luciano reached into his jacket. Lucky Luciano pulled out a revolver, a Smith and Wesson .38, chrome finish. He held it casually, not pointing at Dean, just holding it, letting Dean see it. He walked to the dressing table, put the gun down on the surface. Between the makeup and the glass of water, it sat there, heavy, undeniable. A fact that changed the nature of every conversation. Luciano said this was how things worked. When Lucky Luciano asked for something, he got it. Dean looked at the gun, looked at Luciano, said he understood that was how things had worked until now. Luciano's face hardened. He said Dean was making a mistake that he would not get a chance to regret. Dean asked if that was a threat. Luciano said it was a statement of reality. People who refused Lucky Luciano did not continue in the entertainment business. Sometimes they did not continue breathing. Dean asked if Luciano was planning to kill him over a song. Luciano said he was planning to make Dean understand the way the world actually functioned. Dean said he understood the way the world functioned. He had grown up in it. He had seen how power worked. But he had also decided a long time ago that there were some things he would not do regardless of the cost. Luciano asked what was worth dying over. A principle about booking fees. Dean said it was not about the fee. It was about being treated like a person rather than property. Luciano said Dean was being dramatic. Dean said Luciano had put a gun on the table. Dramatic seemed appropriate. Nobody outside that door knew what was being said. Nobody could hear the conversation. Nobody would know the details for years. What happened in the next 30 seconds would become one of the most talked about moments in the history of Las Vegas. The mirror on the dressing room wall reflected two men and a gun. The light was too bright for a moment like this. Everything looked ordinary. The two men stood there, the gun between them, neither one moving. Luciano said he would give Dean one more chance. Perform tonight, free of charge, as a gesture of respect, or face the consequences. Dean looked at the gun one more time. Then he did something that nobody in that room, including Dean himself, had fully planned. A loaded gun sat on Dean Martin's dressing table. Lucky Luciano, the most dangerous mobster in American history, had just threatened his life. Dean had seconds to decide. Submit and live. Refuse and face consequences that could end with a shallow grave in the Nevada desert. Every performer in Las Vegas would have sung. Every rational person would have backed down. What Dean did next made Lucky Luciano do something he had never done for anyone. The moment is here right now. Dean picked up the gun. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Luciano's hand moved toward his jacket. Dean did not point the gun at anyone. He held it the way you hold something you are examining. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. Fully loaded. He looked at Luciano. Said Mr. Luciano had come prepared. Luciano said he always came prepared. Dean nodded. Said that made sense. Then Dean did something that made Luciano's eyes widen. He put the gun in his own jacket pocket. The gun disappeared into Dean's tuxedo. Luciano stared. Dean said if Luciano wanted him dead, Dean had just made it easier. The gun was now in Dean's possession. Luciano could reach for his backup weapon. The men outside could rush in. Dean would be dead in seconds. Dean had thought about this possibility. Not in that room, not in those 10 seconds, but in the days before. He had understood that this confrontation was coming. He had understood what it would mean to refuse Lucky Luciano and then stand in a room with him. He had made the calculation before Luciano ever knocked on that door. He had decided what he was and was not willing to lose. A career could be rebuilt. Respect for yourself could not be replaced once you gave it away. Dean looked Luciano directly in the eyes. Or Luciano could admit that the threat was empty, that Lucky Luciano had no intention of killing a singer over a performance, that the gun had been theater, designed to scare, and that theater did not work on people who had made peace with the possibility of dying for their principles. The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds. It felt like 10 hours. Luciano's face went through several expressions. Anger, calculation, something that might have been respect, then something nobody in that room expected. Lucky Luciano laughed. Not a small laugh, a real one. Deep from the chest, he laughed like he had just heard the best joke of his life. He said Dean had more courage than any made man he knew. Dean said he would take that as a compliment. Luciano said it was. Then Lucky Luciano did something he had never done for anyone in his entire criminal career. He took a knee. One knee on the floor. Looking up at Dean Martin, he said, "Give me my gun back, and I will give you my respect." Dean pulled the gun from his pocket, handed it back. Luciano stood, put the gun away, extended his hand. Dean shook it. Luciano said Dean would perform at his party. Dean said he would be happy to. For his standard booking fee, Luciano smiled, said of course he would send the payment in advance. Then Luciano said one more thing before he left. He said Dean Martin was under his protection now. Anyone in the organization who bothered Dean would answer to Lucky Luciano personally. Dean thanked him. Luciano said not to thank him. He was doing it for selfish reasons. He wanted to make sure Dean stayed alive long enough for Luciano to hear him sing again. He left. Dean sat down. His hands were not entirely steady, but he had done what he set out to do. He had maintained his dignity. He had not submitted. And somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. Dean performed at Lucky Luciano's private party 3 nights later. He arrived at the Sands private room at 8 o'clock as agreed. The room was filled with men whose names appeared in federal investigations. Lucky Luciano sat front row center. Dean sang for 90 minutes, every song he knew. He gave everything he had, not because he was afraid, because he had agreed to do it. And when Dean Martin agreed to something, he did it well. The applause at the end was genuine. Luciano stood. The entire room stood with him. Luciano approached Dean after the performance. He said that was worth every penny. He handed Dean an envelope. It $10,000, twice his normal fee. Dean tried to return the extra. Luciano refused. He said it was a bonus for making him laugh. Dean asked what was funny. Luciano said Dean had picked up a loaded gun in a room full of mobsters and put it in his own pocket. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing Luciano had ever seen. He still had not decided which. Dean said it was probably both. Luciano agreed. The 2 men shared a drink. They talked for an hour, not about crime, not about threats, about music, about Italy, about the ways the world had changed since they were young. 2 men from immigrant families who had each built something out of nothingness. One through music, one through methods that would never appear in a history book with his name attached. But both men understood what it cost to build something and what it meant to protect it. When Dean left that night, Lucky Luciano walked him to his car. He said he meant what he said about protection. Dean was untouchable now. Anyone who bothered him would have to explain themselves to Luciano. Dean asked why. Luciano said, because Dean had shown him something rare, real courage. The kind that came from principle rather than foolishness. The kind that could not be bought or threatened away. That was worth protecting. Nobody who was in that room would forget what they had seen. Nobody would forget the night Martin stood up to Lucky Luciano and earned his respect instead of his wrath. Within a week, every connected person in Las Vegas knew the story. Dean Martin had picked up Lucky Luciano's gun, had refused to submit, had somehow survived and earned Luciano's respect in the process. Other performers asked Dean how he had done it. Dean said he had not done anything except refuse to be treated like property. They asked if he had been afraid. Dean said of course he had been afraid, but fear was not a reason to compromise on things that mattered. The story spread beyond Las Vegas, reached New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Wherever organized crime had influence, the story of Dean Martin and Lucky Luciano traveled. The details varied. Some versions said Dean had pointed the gun at Luciano. Some said there had been a physical fight. Some said words were exchanged that could not be repeated in polite company. None of those versions were accurate, but they all agreed on the essential truth. Dean Martin had stood up to Lucky Luciano and lived. more than lived, thrived. Nobody who heard the story could quite believe it. Nobody in that world had seen anything like it. Nobody thought a performer could face down the most powerful organized crime figure in America and come out on top. The story became a kind of legend inside the connected world, a story told quietly in rooms where powerful men gathered. As an example of something rare, a man who could not be moved. Dean's career after that October night took off in ways that surprised even him. The casinos competed to book him. The offers increased. The terms improved. Nobody tried to push him around. Nobody demanded free performances. Everyone treated Dean Martin with the respect that Lucky Luciano had decided he deserved. Luciano and Dean never became close friends. Their worlds were too different, but they maintained a mutual respect until Luciano's death in 1962. When Luciano died, Dean sent flowers to the funeral. He did not attend. That would have been inappropriate given who Luciano was. But the flowers were acknowledged, and people who knew understood what they meant. The people who were in that dressing room when Dean picked the gun gave accounts over the years that followed. Dean's manager spoke about it in a 1970 interview. He said he had thought he was watching Dean commit suicide. He said, when Dean put that gun in his pocket, the manager had actually looked away because he could not watch what he thought was about to happen. When nothing happened, when Luciano laughed instead of shooting, the manager said he had to sit down because his legs stopped working. A musician who had been waiting outside the dressing room gave an account in 1985. He said he heard Luciano laughing through the door and thought he had lost his mind. Nobody made Lucky Luciano laugh like that. The musician said he saw Luciano leave with the biggest smile on his face, like he had just made a new friend, which, in a way, he had. A casino executive who worked at the Sands said in a 2000 interview that the night of Luciano's party was the best performance he ever saw Dean give. He said Dean sang like his life depended on it, which maybe it had. But more than that, Dean sang like he was free. Like he had proven something to himself and could now just enjoy the work. Frank Sinatra, who heard about the incident from Luciano himself, mentioned it in a 1980s conversation that was recorded. Frank said Luciano had told him Dean was the only civilian who ever made him back down from a position. Luciano had said it with admiration. He said Dean understood something that most people did not. That real power was not about guns or threats. It was about being willing to accept the worst possible outcome in defense of something that mattered. Frank said he was not surprised. He had known for years that Dean was built differently from most men. The calm was not an act. It was the foundation. Dean had been willing to die rather than submit. That made him more powerful in that moment than all of Luciano's guns and men. Nobody who knew Dean from that point forward doubted what he was made of. Nobody questioned his resilience again. Nobody who heard the full story ever looked at Dean Martin the same way again. The man behind the smile, behind the easy coolness, behind the glass of apple juice he carried everywhere as if it were something stronger, was someone who had looked death in the face and handed it back. October 1954. Lucky Luciano put a gun on Dean Martin's table. Dean picked it up, put it in his own pocket, dared Luciano to follow through. Lucky Luciano kneeled. The most feared mobster in American history showed respect to a singer from Ohio. Because real power is not about who has the gun. It is about who is willing to die for their principles. If you want more stories about Dean Martin, the moments that revealed who he really was, the courage that defined him, there is an entire playlist waiting. We are at 300 subscribers, working towards 700 to keep making these. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What Dean Martin did on that October night in 1954 looks insane from the outside. Picking up a loaded gun that a mobster had just used to threaten you. Putting it in your own pocket. Daring him to use it. Every survival instinct says run, submit, apologize, live to fight another day. Dean did the opposite. He escalated. He called the bluff. He made himself more vulnerable, not less. And somehow that vulnerability became strength. Lucky Luciano had threatened hundreds of people in his life. Most of them had submitted immediately. Some had tried to fight back. None had done what Dean did. None had simply accepted death as a possibility and moved forward anyway. That acceptance changed the dynamic completely. Luciano could not threaten someone who had made peace with being killed. The gun stopped being leverage and became just a piece of metal. Dean understood something that most people miss about power. Real power is not about controlling others. It is about controlling yourself. About deciding what you will and will not accept regardless of consequences. Luciano had spent his life controlling others through fear. He had built an empire on making people more afraid of him than of anything else. Dean was not more afraid of Luciano than of losing his self-respect. That made Dean untouchable in a way that bodyguards and weapons never could. The principle Dean defended that night was simple. He was a professional performer who worked for agreed fees. He was not property to be summoned at will. He was not a servant. He was a man with dignity who would maintain that dignity even if it cost him his life. Lucky Luciano recognized that, respected it, protected it, because Luciano, for all his violence and crime, understood the value of a man who could not be broken. He had spent his life surrounded by men who said yes. Men who nodded and smiled and agreed with everything he said, because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. Those men were useful, but they were not respectable. Dean was different. Dean had said no and meant it and stood behind it when the cost became real. That was something Luciano had not encountered in a very long time. The gun on the table was a test. Dean passed it by refusing to treat it as one. He did not perform courage. He simply was not afraid of the right things. He was afraid of losing himself. He was not afraid of dying. That distinction made all the difference. Dean Martin was many things to many people. He was the voice on the radio, the face on the movie screen, the man who made effortless look like a talent you were born with. But in that dressing room in October of 1954, with a loaded gun in his hand and the most dangerous man in America watching, he was simply a man who knew exactly who he was. Nobody could take that from him, not even Lucky Luciano. The boy from Steubenville who had changed his name from Dino Crossetti to Dean Martin had built something inside himself that no amount of money or power or threat could touch. That was the real performance, not the singing, not the smile, the man underneath both. The story of Dean Martin and Lucky Luciano is not a story about mob connections or Hollywood glamour. It is a story about what happens when principle meets power, when someone decides that some things matter more than survival. Dean lived because he was willing to die. Lucky Luciano kneeled because Dean would not. Think about what that means. Not as a metaphor, as a literal sequence of events in a real room. A man put a gun on a table to make another man submit. The second man picked up the gun and handed it back to the first, not as surrender, as a statement. The statement was simple. You cannot threaten a man with something he has already made peace with. That room in Las Vegas held one of the most dangerous men alive and one of the most famous singers alive. The dangerous man kneeled. The singer walked out. That is the lesson of October 1954. Real power bows to real principle. Always.